Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. My name is Paul Harris and I'm president of the City Club's Board of Directors. I'm very pleased to extend a City Club welcome to today's speaker, Professor William Graham, Dean of the Faculty of Divinity, John Lord O'Brien, Professor of Divinity, and Murray A. Albertson, Professor of Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard University. Professor Graham is a second Harvard University professor in the past 2 weeks to appear at the City Club to share his insights on an important topic, in the case of today's remarks, the intersection of Islam and politics. I would also like to invite our special guest today, Tom Stanton, to the podium to provide further introductory remarks on Professor Graham. Mr. Stanton is a partner with the law firm Squire Sanders, and in 2009 completed a 20-year stint as vice chair, a position he held for 1 year, and 19-year stint as managing partner of the firm's management committee. It also happens that Mr. Stanton attended Harvard Divinity School, and he currently serves on the school's leadership council. So I'd like to invite him to the podium.
Paul, thank you. And I'm delighted to join you, Paul, in introducing Dean Bill Graham to all of you and welcoming him to the City Club. I'm especially pleased to be doing that at the John W. Barkley Memorial Forum. John Barkley was a long esteemed partner at Squire Sanders, and it's nice to close that circle. Bill and I didn't know each other when we were both at Harvard Divinity at the same time, but I have gotten to know him as a member of Harvard's Divinity School's Leadership Council and have long since joined his very large group of admirers. As Paul noted, he enjoys a joint appointment to both the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and the Divinity School, and is now Dean of the Divinity School. Theological education has always been a core part of Harvard, and the Divinity School was established as its first graduate school in 1816. Since then, it has remained a leader in religious studies. Upon becoming dean in 2002, Bill Graham has built upon this strong foundation and, in particular, has led HDS as a non-denominational divinity school in a major research university to take advantage of, in his words, the freedom to really broach all questions that might arise with respect to history, theology, ethics, and public policy. Today, and thanks much to Dean's efforts, Harvard is truly a vibrant and committed center for the study of all world religions. Extraordinary students of all religious traditions, including Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, Islamic, Buddhist, and Hinduist, among others, come to Harvard to deepen their understanding of and contribute to the scholarly advancement of their own faith, while also learning comparatively about and gaining great respect for the religious traditions of others. Especially in the complexity of the world today, this is obviously important, indeed you might say essential work. And we can all be thankful to Dean Graham for his visionary leadership in driving it forward so effectively. So Bill, thank you for that. Thank you for being here. And we'll look forward to your perspectives on religion and politics in Islam.
Thank you very much for the generous introductions. More and more every day, it seems, bigger and bigger myths are being propagated to arouse people at large to anger, fear, and often irrational attitudes that brook no compromise. By big myths, I mean, of course, above all, those things that try to give you simple explanations for complex things. The kinds of myths that, if we buy them, can lead us to do bad things to good people and feel self-righteous in the process of doing so. Big myths mislead. They serve political and other agendas, but not truth or reason or moderation, let alone understanding and compassion. Nowhere today do we see some of these big myths more persistently deployed and pursued than with respect to Islamic religion and Muslims, both at home and abroad. Today I want to address one big and dangerous myth that engages me as a scholar and especially as an historian who spent much of his adult life studying Islam, but also as a U.S. citizen who cares deeply about his country, but just as deeply about the rest of the world that our children and their children will inherit from us. This myth is associated with the widespread idea in both American popular and even some policy circles that history today is increasingly being determined by a so-called clash of civilizations. This clash is touted as the explanation for the violent conflicts already occurring around the world in our new century, in particular the post-9/11 tensions and conflicts between, in the terms of this myth, Christian civilization and Islamic civilization. Sadly, many American politicians and strategists seem to have bought this big myth, and in their uncritical acceptance of it lies the danger of self-fulfilling prophecy. If we act as if the myth is true, we may make it so. Nowhere is this more likely than in the current world situation in which the myth of an imagined monolithic Islamic civilization set over against an imagined monolithic Christian civilization feeds American xenophobia, extremist Christian, and even Jewish zealotry, and most dangerously, the anti-Muslim bias of more radical American and Western policymakers. Ironically enough, it also feeds Muslim extremist thinking and zealotry itself. The other group that has embraced this myth of the clash of civilizations is precisely the small but resolute cohort of extremist Islamist movements that have been calling for and even attempting an attack in the name of Islam on America and the West for several decades now. They too believe, or at least want Muslims to believe, that Islam is fated to clash with Christianity forever. They see themselves, few in number as they actually are, as the only true spokespersons for the well over 1 billion Muslims worldwide, and they want to persuade moderate Muslims that they are their spokespersons. Their only concern is to win the civilizational conflict they are fueling. Thus we have, I think, an unholy alliance between non-Muslim and Muslim ideologues. Both have an interest in the big myth of civilizational clash because it justifies their own political agendas. Both hope, but for very different reasons, that if they keep repeating this myth, if they act again and again as if it were true, it will become true. I don't have the time, and you don't have the time, or I'm sure the patience, for me to try to unpack all the elements today of this big myth. Instead, I want to look at only one crucial element of it and see how attention to history can help us see the fallacy of this dangerous claim about our current world situation. At the heart of this myth of monolithic civilizational adversaries lies another myth, which is now widely found acceptance in the media and occasionally even in the academy, namely that in Islam, politics and religion are so inseparable that the only truly Islamic form of government is a theocratic state. This notion has been treated as gospel truth by some Western leaders and analysts and as Quranic truth by some highly politicized Islamic reformers and revolutionaries. Both camps often act as if it were true, and both seem not to care that this myth could justify many kinds of mayhem. The fact of the matter is that neither modern Islamist extremists nor modern Western commentators have any real historical basis for the argument that Islamic tradition holds that the state should be subject to theocratic religious authority and religious rather than civil codes of law. Let's see why. Both the Quran and Islamic tradition testify that Islam from the outset meant religious submission to God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Jesus. They offer a comprehensive interpretation of what God requires of human beings in the way of faith, personal piety and observance, morality and ethics, and social responsibility. They offer no political direction or instruction, let alone any blueprint for political order and governance. Until the year 632 of the Common Era, so long as Muhammad was alive, definitive prophetic interpretation, of course, was available to the new community, and religious and political leadership were united in the very same person. This was, I think, perhaps the closest to theocracy that Muslims have ever come. They would never get that close again. Then, in the first decades after prophetic leadership ended with Muhammad's death, there did gradually emerge three approaches to the problem of what kind of post-prophetic leadership the young Islamic polity, which was rapidly becoming a small empire, should have. The first of these three approaches, and the one that was soon rejected by the mass of Muslims, was that of a party called the Khawarij, the seceders, who wanted an egalitarian society of believers led by the most pious Muslim among them. In their theocracy, non-believers were to be excluded, or even among some groups of the Khawarij, they were to be killed. A second approach, also rejected early on by the majority of Muslims, was that of a party claiming that God intended Muslim religious and political leadership to pass from Muhammad the Prophet through his blood descendants. This view eventually came to include the idea that these leaders should be obeyed as divinely chosen theocrats in a religiously defined state. This group splintered early into several factions, but became known gradually and collectively as the Partisans of Ali, that is, the Shiite Ali, or the Shi'is as we know them today. They, of course, remain to this day the major Muslim sectarian minority, primarily represented now in Iran and eastern Iraq. But some 90% of all contemporary Muslims, those who call themselves the followers of the true Sunnah, the true path or way, and namely the Sunnis as we know them, they trace their Islam to a third approach to leadership that emerged in those early decades after the death of the Prophet. This view, which ultimately won the day, rejected both of the theocratic options for the Islamic State, that of the seceders on the one hand and the Shiites on the other. This was the view that politically Muslims should accept the most capable ruler, not the most pious nor one of pure lineage chosen by God. This pragmatic approach to politics led the great majority of Muslims to give political allegiance to first one or another of Muhammad's former lieutenants as being his rightful successor or caliph, the Arabic word is khalifa. Then when the fifth caliph or successor, who was the first to come not from the Prophet's original circle, and certainly not from his family, but in fact from a family in Mecca that had opposed the Prophet, when this fifth successor managed to found a dynastic rule of his own descendants, the majority of Muslims still supported him and his successors, even though they were clearly only political, not religious leaders, and sometimes not even recognizably religious as persons. Meanwhile, the burgeoning group of religious and legal specialists, the ulama, that is the learned, those who have knowledge and wisdom, those who devoted themselves to interpreting the scripture and to the prophets and to transmitting the prophets' legacy to meet the religious and particularly the legal demands of the faithful, they became the effective religious successors, or khulafa, as the plural of khalifa, of the prophet. So much is that so that there was even a saying created in the early days well after the death of the prophet, and then of course attributed to Muhammad himself, namely that the true successors, the true khulafa, are the ulama. So the religious leadership in that view passes to those who are learned in religious matters. Medieval and pre-modern Islamic history then saw the office of caliph continue to be recognized as supreme authority in the expanding Islamic world, but only rarely did the caliph wield any actual political or religious authority. From the mid-9th century onward, he was little more than a figurehead or a symbol of an Islamic unity that did not exist on the ground. Or he was one of two or more competing claimants at various times to be the caliph altogether and unable to put down his rivals. The myth of theocratic rule as the Islamic norm, or of the caliphate as having existed as a theocratic single institution in Islam all the way down to the fall of the Ottoman Empire, is truly a myth. It's simply not historical fact. And this myth normally ignores the reality that for centuries multiple Islamic societies were governed actually and certainly politically by kings or governors in local regions who were occasionally pious Muslims but rarely claimed religious authority. They paid lip service to the caliph as commander of the faithful, but they ruled on their own authority. Meanwhile, it was the ulama who carried virtually all functional, effective religious authority as custodians of the faith and the law. They recognized the caliph's role as symbolic leader of the Muslims, just as they recognized local leaders as local Muslim authorities, but they themselves control the development of moral and legal norms. It was from their ranks typically that there arose the leaders of religious opposition to the all too worldly governmental authorities, whether local, regional, or international, who were rarely, if ever, seen by pious Muslims as paragons of Islam. So the split between religious and political authority not only started early, it endured. I think all of this brief rush through the history of Islam should indicate that it would be hard, I believe, to argue from Islamic history that, as one Western journalist has written, Islam is at once a religion, a temporal order, and a state. I'm quoting here. Government is therefore given over entirely to a religious mission. There have, of course, been a few cases in which a Muslim leader aimed at and claimed religious authority with at least some passing success, but these have very much been the exceptions in the sweep of Islamic history, and generally extreme exceptions, not the norm at all. Even the regional, religiously defined jihad movements of the later 18th and 19th centuries, which by conquest and institution of new governments sought to impose a purified form of Islam in parts of West Africa, Arabia, and South and Central Asia, even they had only very limited success in founding religious states that endured more than briefly. And when we finally come to the global Islamic world of the past 2 centuries, new complexity enters in with the radical intrusion into the Islamic heartlands of Western, non-Muslim power and ideology. The conjoined impact of an often militant Christianity, together with the militarily and economically aggressive secular West, was a powerful and traumatic one in the Islamic world as it was elsewhere. There was, of course, a certain civilizational clash in this process of Western empire building, but there was also a powerful commingling of civilizations as well. Before the 1800s, the rivalries of Christian Europe and the Islamic Ottoman Empire had for 400 years played out between 2 cultural worlds largely closed to each other. But this changed after 1800, and from about that time, with colonial imperialism and militant Christian missionizing, the Muslim majority lands from Morocco to Indonesia began to come under a double cultural attack. Both Christian and secular modernist on the one hand, and as well, on the other hand, as a double political attack, both economic and military. The effects were massive throughout the Islamic world, East and West. Out of the experience of foreign imperialism and colonialism, there arose in the Islamic world, in the Islamic, just as it did in the non-Western world, first a number of political efforts to modernize in imitation of the Western model and to assimilate modern European norms to national realities of the Middle Eastern, South Asian, or Southeast Asian Islamic worlds. From the late 19th century, Islamic reformers began to adopt the post-French Revolution understanding of the state as a nation of citizens rather than subjects. And most Muslim majority states today represent in some fashion, however distorted by ruling tyrannies, the results of this, especially in the very typical institution of a civil legal code based on European models and of constitutions and representative assemblies, however circumscribed their powers may be. For a variety of reasons, the attempts to mold Muslim-majority societies into Western-style republics never really took. Western democracies never adequately supported representative government in Islamic lands, and most of their client states ended up under autocratic, not representative rule. Witness Algeria, Libya, Pakistan, Sudan, or Indonesia as just a few examples. Similarly, most post-colonial socialist governments in the Islamic world also ended in autocratic rule, as with Nasser's state in Egypt or the Ba'athist regimes of Iraq and Syria. As a result, the major Islamic reform movements of the past century focused until very recent decades on internal social and political reform, virtually never on Islamizing the state, let alone, of course, on transnational Islamic agendas, such as we've seen a few of in more recent decades. In this regard, the Shiite Iranian Revolution of 1978 ushered in something new. The Islamic Republic, as it is called, or an Islamic polity, if you like, in which Muslimness was to be the defining quality of true citizens, and the state was to be guided constitutionally by Islamic norms and principles. Khomeini's vilayati faqih, or authority or governance of the jurist, is a key example of this. Even before and especially since this revolution, we have also seen other groups, both Shi'i and Sunni, some extremist and militant, in fact, who have taken up the ideal of an Islamic state elsewhere, such as in Pakistan or the Sudan, where efforts have been made in that direction. What is new, at least since the 1970s, are radical activist Islamist movements aimed at a global, idealized Islam that is usually at odds with all existing state orders, East and West. These movements typically demand an Islamic state in all Muslim countries, without often a very much specification what that means, and they implicitly buy into the myth of Islam as inherently political, not to mention the big myth of a single Islamic civilization, rather than a multiplicitous world of Islamic thought and practice that we know is the reality. Typically, they have gained popular support by their opposition to the non-Muslim West, which is easily seen in the Islamic world as the oppressive, exploitative, monolithic enemy of Muslim peoples, a view not unlike that of the big myth I am criticizing. And given the long history of Western domination of the Islamic world, it is not hard to see, of course, why Muslims might easily buy into this line of thought. In particular, the statelessness and cultural deracination of a radical international terrorist group such as Al-Qaeda, or even the one could even say that to some degree about the Shiite, on the Shiite side of things, Hezbollah, that such a terrorist group is something new and not directly related to the power struggles going on between entrenched ruling elites and the nationalist reformers and revolutionaries inside almost every Muslim majority state. Such extremists cannot be seen as true representatives of any traditional Islamic norms or values, however much they may claim to be so. They advocate militant transnational action as a xenophobic, anti-American, or anti-Western agenda, rather than as a positive religio-political agenda of reform for a particular Muslim context, a particular nation or region. And there are, in fact, many very different, by the way, very politically moderate or even quietist Islamist movements underway today, but the militant ideologues and terrorists get the headlines over the far more numerous Islamists who seek personal transformation or build low-income housing, provide medical care and disaster relief, and offer child care and schooling for the underclasses in their societies, where usually the governments have been unable to do so or unwilling to do so. I think we have seen since the 1970s the extreme development in a shift over the past 200 years from internally directed reform movements of the early Islamic jihads to late 20th century attempts at internal nationalist reform, mid-20th century attempts at internal nationalist reforms, and then to the often violent religio-political extremists of the past few decades. These extremists have their own form of the clash of civilizations myth, as I've indicated, and do feel that every Muslim majority state has to become a true Islamic polity and battle foreign oppression from Christian America and Europe. Of course, there's often included in that is Jewish Israel and Jewish America and Europe as well. Even though their ultimate success is highly unlikely, and I think we can say today that we may have already seen the apogee of these kinds of movements. I think that what we're seeing in recent months, and we can talk about that in the question period, not something I'm a specialist about, but something I'm willing to at least voice some opinions about. I think what we've been seeing, in fact, is not the Islamist movements, these internationally oriented Islamist movements taking the lead, but very different kinds of populist rebellions, if you like. Even though the ultimate success of these internationally oriented Islamist movements and the violent Islamist movements, I think, is highly unlikely, their recent flourishing can tell us, I think, a lot about the dangers for today's world that come when people buy into a big myth that pits whole cultures, religions, or civilizations over against each other in simplistic fashion. This is why big myths are so dangerous. Suffering, humiliation, and fear make such myths attractive, but they lead or attempt to lead people to support simplistic and ultimately destructive agendas. In Islamic lands, traditional, typically uneasy relationships between state and religion have been challenged in recent years. When modern activist Islamist groups, especially the extremists among them, have called for a return to true Islam, that true Islam is often their own essentialist myth of a theocratic state like that, often the model, of course, being that of the Prophet Muhammad 1,400 years ago. It is a myth, of course, but it is a powerful myth, and it feeds the bigger myth of the clash of civilizations. Let us not be deceived, however, into thinking that it is intrinsically Islamic, any more than the Spanish Inquisition was intrinsically Christian. Meanwhile, we must oppose those non-Muslim religious or political ideologues, as well as some so-called experts in the West, who would use this myth to drum up hatred for and willingness even to do battle with an imagined evil empire of Islam. And as we have been seeing in recent months, as I've said, Islamic extremists are not, in fact, the forces that have surged to the forefront in Muslim-majority countries of the Middle East and taken on the police states they've lived under and the dictatorial leaders that have determined their fates for far too long, and that of course, have also exploited these countries with Western acquiescence and even support. For all of the aforementioned reasons, I want simply in closing to urge caution about the big myths we are constantly hearing, not least those that keep us locked in an ongoing clash of civilizations. Such a myth as this one is fed by the real, truly evil things that people have done to other people, as in the long domination of Muslim peoples by our own Western world in its colonial era, or in the trauma visited in America upon Americans by the savagery of the 9/11 attacks. This myth is also pernicious in the evil it has brought in its wake. Any better, more peaceful world surely lies beyond any imagined clash of civilizations between the Islamic and the Christian or Jewish worlds. Or for that matter, any other clash, I would argue, between allegedly incompatible civilizational rivals. Thank you very much.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are listening to a Friday forum featuring Professor William Grand, Dean of the Faculty of Divinity at Harvard University. We'll return to our speaker momentarily for our traditional City Club questions, and we would ask that you start formulating your questions now, and please keep them short and to the point so we can get as many in as possible. Members and guests alike are welcome to attend City Club forums, and we certainly hope that everyone listening will join the City Club and become active in our ongoing civic dialogue. We welcome all of you here and those listening to WCPN 90.3 FM, WCLV, WTAM, or one of the many radio stations across the country. Our television broadcast partner is WVIZ PBS IdeaStream. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC, and our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. We are very pleased to welcome guests today at tables hosted by the law firm of Baker Hostetler and the law firm of Squire Sanders. Thank you very much for joining us today. And as we heard earlier from Tom Stanton, today's program is the annual John W. Barclay Memorial Forum, made possible by a generous gift from Mr. Barclay's estate. We are also very pleased to welcome students who are here today as part of the City Club student program. Participation of these students is made possible by a generous grant from the Jeffrey David Epstein Memorial Student Fund. With us today are students from the Cleveland School of Science and Medicine. Will the students please stand to be recognized? Thank you very much for joining us today. Now we'd like to return to our speaker for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests and students. Holding the microphones today are City Club Marketing and Membership Manager Heather Sikora and Program Director Carrie Miller. First question, please.
Dr. Graham, I think that it's very important that we understand the historical background of Islam and how it grew and the divisions within it. Now, though, we have a group of people who believe that they should either give their own life or come to realize what they want as an Islamic state by terrorism. What do we now do?
Well, I often think that I think of the novel of Italo Calvino that ends at the very end, that in a world that is full of inferno, what do we do? And the answer is that we try to support those who are not inferno, as he puts it. I think we try to support the Muslims of more moderate demeanor, which is the great majority of Muslims. We can try to do that. We can try to do that occasionally politically, which we often don't do. We do have groups like Al-Qaeda and I would say Hezbollah on the Shiite side, both of whom have resorted to the terrorist tactics that you are talking about. And and Hezbollah, for instance, is formed out of several smaller groups. Both of those are relatively new things. They've arisen, really in what I would call within my lifetime, let us say, so in relatively recent history. And both, I hope, are ultimately passing phenomena. But they've been, of course, very successful in getting the world's attention. But I do think we have to remember that the numbers we're dealing with here are still small. It doesn't make the threat, when the threat comes, any less for the people that it hits. But I think we should put it in perspective and realize that this is not what the majority of Muslims are doing or even supporting, for that matter.
Thank you, Dr. Graham, for your wisdom and wonderful remarks. I'd like to ask, as an American Muslim, I'd like to ask a question about domestic politics, if I could, and that is what I call religious intolerance bills, the anti-Sharia law bills that are creeping up in more than 13 states. What do they portend for the 2012 elections, and what do you think about Islamophobia in America, particularly related to the anti-Sharia law bills?
Well, I can only speak as a citizen about this, and I find it very un-American, actually. But I think it's based, of course, again, on myths, I think, to some degree, and that is the notion that Muslims cannot live as a minority in a different kind of state, a Christian state or a Hindu state or whatever else. But history, again, tells us otherwise. Muslims have been minorities down through history in other countries and have managed to find a way to actually pursue their own Islamic faith and tradition, and yet be citizens or subjects in another kind of realm, and that is not Islamic at all. And so it would not be something new or unusual, and we've had Muslims living in this country now for generations, not just since World War II, but well back into the 19th century. Sizable numbers of Muslims living quite well and being very good American citizens. And I think a lot of the misunderstanding is, again, based on the perpetuation of myths about the incompatibility of Islamic faith with a non-Islamic state. And that really is, in a way, ultimately the point of what I was trying to do as an historian, going back a little bit and racing you through Islamic history to say that it hasn't been the case that there have been very many Islamic states that insisted upon Sharia as the only law. In fact, in many of the greatest Islamic states, you had, as under the Ottomans, a secular law, the Qanun in the case of Ottoman law, which in fact governed most of everyday life, and the Sharia is then kept really for family and what we would call purely civil matters. So even in Islamic states, it's not the case that the Sharia has been the only rule of the land, and I think we have to remember that.
Dr. Graham, I was wondering if you could expand upon that issue of assimilation, especially within the modern context of Western Europe.
Yes.
Where it does not seem to be going, or the perception is it's not going well.
No, I mean, I think that I think it's not always going well there. I think there's both there's a lot of very strong feeling in some quarters that again stirs up. I think feeling in on the other side, and this works in both directions, I think. And you can see this in Denmark, you can see this in the Netherlands, you can see it even in Germany, and certainly in France, or salient places I can think of where this is happening now. Again, the question is, what kind of assimilation? Can you assimilate? I mean, does the headscarf in France, for instance, mean incapacity to assimilate? I don't think it has to at all. There are too many instances of people wearing headscarves today in America, today in all parts of the world, where the women involved are perfectly engaged citizens of secular states or certainly of non-Islamic states. So it's certainly quite possible. Now, how easy it is to come by is another story. And it's interesting how each of the European countries, and you have to include Great Britain, I think, in continental Europe in this, has treated the situation of growing Muslim minorities very, very differently. And I think that because of that, you do get different results. And I think in some ways in Britain, where you probably have, I don't know now what the percentages are, it's just enough out of my ken that I don't know what the current percentages are, but I would guess that there are probably, in percentage-wise, more Muslims in Britain as a percentage of the population than there are in any of the other continental countries. Can someone correct me on that? In any case, there's certainly a large number. And in Britain, in many ways, without trying to force all social conformity, they are managing through the usual democratic institutions of local councils and of governance of towns and cities and so forth. They are managing to deal reasonably well, I think, even in the presence of some Islamic extremist groups. They are still have really dealt, I think, remarkably well with integrating Muslims from all over the world, from South Asia as well as from the Middle East. And so every country is going to be a little different, but I don't think the fact that in one place it is really leading to a lot of street riots and problems and assassinations and so on, that means that it's an impossibility. I think it often means, again, that various fears have been stirred and stoked to the point that it becomes very, very hard to reach compromises. So it's just the sad fact of the world we live in, I'm afraid. But again, I don't think it's intrinsic, in other words, to Islamic tradition that it has to be that way.
Dr. Graham,
yes.
On several occasions today you spoke about extremism within Muslim
yes.
religion. And there have been some recent examples of it that are rather perplexing. Just a few years ago, Salman Rushdie, a novelist, wrote a book with some criticism, aspersions upon the religion, and he was ostracized and a death warrant was issued against
yes.
him. More recently, there have been cartoonists in Denmark, I believe, which
yes.
had some cartoons that to many of us seemed rather innocuous, but they were critical of Allah and of Muhammad, and it resulted in riots and widespread destruction of property and some deaths. And very recently, within the last month, a very inconsequential minister in Florida, a congregation of 50 people, publicly burned his Koran, and that too engendered all kinds of violence. Yes. Is there something in the Koran or in the teachings of Muslim which in some way don't approve, but at least provide some justification for strong action being taken, which to many of us seems very, the punishment doesn't seem to fit the crime at all? And if so, is there any suggestion you have as to how that could be counteracted?
Well, your question is actually much more complex than it seems on the surface, because it could get us into everything from questions of apostasy in the Salman Rushdie case to all sorts of other things, Mr. Edelstein. But I must say that I don't believe there's anything in the Quran or in the classical Islamic tradition, certainly, that would give people and would in fact condone the particular actions that you cite in each case. However, I think we have to recognize that in the context of today's world, and I tried in fact to set my comments towards the end against the backdrop of the colonial and imperial period where Western Christian nations, or Judeo-Christian, whatever you want to call them, nations really made short work of the rest of the world in a lot of ways. We did exploit the rest of the world in all sorts of ways, and that world is still recovering. The so-called third world in particular is still recovering from that century and a half or so of frankly, misrule and exploitation in most cases. And as a result, I think we're dealing with a highly inflammable situation by and large. I do think that, as a teacher of mine, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, pointed out many years ago, back in the 50s, the Muslims, he was talking particularly about Arab Muslims, but in general, the Muslims, I think, really have had the feeling for some time that history has somehow gone awry and gone against them in a lot of ways. And I think that it's very easy to stir up peoples who feel threatened, whether they're actually threatened or not. If they feel threatened and feel that they and their parents and grandparents have lived through an era where they have suffered greatly at the hands of, in this case, the Western secular world or the Western Christian or Jewish world, then if they feel they have suffered very badly from this, they are going to react often what we would call irrationally, I guess. I think particularly at the very popular level. And those are the people that you get into the streets to riot when someone who is a no one to us, even here in the States, burns a Koran. But you have to remember that that Koran burning was on every TV station, every TV network, all over the world, constantly. I mean, our own networks were as guilty or more guilty than anyone else. It wasn't just Al Jazeera. It was also ABC and NBC and CBS and so on who gave this man all of the stage to incite people's fears and worries and concerns. Because as far as an average person in the streets of Pakistan would know, how would they not know that this is what's going on all over America, and they're just seeing one example of it. So all of these things have to be taken, I think, not just in a religious context or in the context of what is religiously, historically right or wrong, but in fact in terms of the social and political context we live in. And it's a very unhappy context around much of the world, and it's very confused and very mixed up, and we're going to get these kinds of extreme reactions to things, I'm afraid. Yes. All right, we've got one in the back.
How is religion going to hurt Libya or Egypt?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
How is religion going to hurt Libya or Egypt?
I don't know that it's going to hurt either. You know, this is very interesting, I think. Again, I'm certainly not a political scientist or a modern specialist, but as just another citizen watching what's happening and somebody who's spent a lot of time in the Islamic world in years past, I can say that I really do think that, first of all, they're very different situations. In neither of those situations do I see a strong role of religious groups or religious parties playing a role. In the Libyan case, they're much stronger are the tribal groupings and the tribal alliances and so on that lie behind some of the divisions there, and also the simple fact of rebellion there against a really oppressive regime. But the oppression breaks down, or the resistance breaks down more along tribal lines than religious lines. So I don't even really see religion as a very strong factor there. Now, you could always have a religious party emerge and try to take advantage of the situation. I couldn't preclude that. I think that's more likely to be a danger in Egypt, where again, I don't see even the Muslim Brethren, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan as they're known, I don't see the Muslim Brothers as in fact being a major instigator of what happened in Egypt. It appears that this was much more a various groups of, technically facile Egyptians. You have to remember that in Egypt there are tremendous numbers of university-educated Egyptians that are without jobs and that are having a very difficult time economically all across Egypt, but they're very well educated. They were prepared to communicate with one another and to get the word out. And I think the oppression in Egypt, and it's something I've seen over many years, going back to the Nasser years, and certainly through the Sadat regime as well as under Mubarak, it's been a police state for a very long time. And I think when you get this kind of technologically savvy people, even if they're not part of a coherent movement, when you get them communicating with each other and then communicating more widely to people who maybe aren't so technologically advanced, you've got the real, as we're learning, you've got the real stuff of a revolution. And I think the very fact they were able to adhere to a nonviolent revolution is some indication of the widespread support for this movement, as well as for the intelligence of the people who actually managed to take charge. But I don't see any religious figures in those taking charge. Now, I think the Muslim Brethren are there, but you have to remember they have participated in elections and in government, even when the elections were really shams. They've participated in that now for more than 2 decades, and they're not a party that is overtly trying to overthrow an established regime and set up an Islamist regime. We could all, things can always change, but I have a feeling that in Egypt we've at least got a shot, depending upon what the military does, we have a shot at actually maybe seeing some kind of transition to a representative rule. I don't know that that can happen. It's not going to be easy, and I think the big difficulty will be who does emerge as somebody the people can rally behind if the army lets that happen. Does that help a little?
Doctor, whether it's women being barred from driving their own automobile in Saudi Arabia, or whether it's women being required to wear the burqa outside of their homes under the Taliban in Afghanistan. The role of women in the Muslim world certainly is much different than it is in the Western world. My question is kind of twofold. Are these same kinds of restrictions on the roles of women present in the largest Muslim societies, which would be Indonesia and the Muslim population of India? And are these restrictions based on the Quran, or are they from ethnic backgrounds?
That's an important question, I think. Not an easy one, but certainly an important one. You know, it's the case with scriptures that you can basically, the devil can cite scripture to his own use, and that tends to happen with the Quran as scripture, just as it does with the Bible as scripture. And I would say that you can find probably isolated things in the Quran. I mean, if you take the inheritance laws in the Quran, which were actually an attempt to give women the right to inherit altogether, whereas in the Muslim, Christian, Jewish, etc. world of that time in the Near East, they were basically chattel and did not have rights of inheritance. So an attempted reform, in a way, by the Quran comes out looking today as though it's total discrimination against women because they inherit half what the male inherits. So you can pick out things like that and certainly say that it's very difficult to get around some of those things to get utter equality between the sexes in the eyes of religious law. But you can also find equally an immense number of passages in the Quran that speak to the necessity for men and women to treat each other with respect, to treat each other equally, for husbands to in fact, really, I think in a very real sense, respect their wives in ways that had not been common, certainly before that time. So you can find in the Quran about what you want to justify particular social actions. And I think the Quran itself has been used, and in many ways used by generations of male ulama, if you like, down through the centuries, quite frankly, in many societies, to keep women in a lower position socially and certainly politically. There have been notable exceptions to that, but by and large, that's been the case. Today, I think we're beginning to see women who are studying the Quran, and particularly in the Western world, but I think more and more in places like Indonesia, for instance, you're finding highly educated women who are taking leadership roles. In Indonesia, you certainly at one time, I mean, certainly back in the 60s and 70s, I've been back to Indonesia recently, but you certainly could find men praying behind women prayer leaders as the imama, which is unheard of in the Arab world, for instance, today, or the Iranian world. You could never have that. So again, Islam presents a lot of multiple interpretations of both Scripture and the legal tradition itself. And it makes it very difficult to say that nothing is possible. I think if we had probably gone around in the early 19th century around European societies and American society, we would have probably seen the status of women not unlike it is today. And we have to remember that even in the enlightened Western world, I think women in Switzerland got the vote when? In the last 20 years, right? Something like that. I mean, we still have holdovers from a time when our societies looked very much on the male-female rights issue, very much like many and most Muslim societies look today. But it doesn't seem to me to make it impossible for us to think about a world where that changes. Now, we've seen some countries move in enlightened, what we would call enlightened directions, and then regress. But our hope is that the general pattern will be up and not down. And that's been the very sad thing, I think, about a lot of the extreme Islamist movements, is they tend to be the most extreme in terms of wanting a secondary place for women. They, of course, put it in different terms. They want it to be respect for women by keeping them covered or whatever else. There are lots of euphemisms they use for what they're doing, but in effect, it certainly is the case that they are perpetuating the male-dominated paradigm that has been the case in many Muslim societies in the past. And I certainly would never deny that. But I don't think it means that we have to assume that the future is closed. That's all I think I could say. Yes.
Yes. Dr. Graham, I think in a religious sense, much of the world's people of the world are in organized religions are descendants of Abraham, and when you look at Islam, Judaism, Christianity, and what many would argue are the similarities between, in terms of core beliefs, dogma, etc. I was wondering if you could comment on, assuming that that's true, on the divisions and much of the hatred and divisiveness that is seen in society today, particularly when the majority of the world probably falls under this category.
No, that's a, I think a very good question. It's an extremely difficult question to answer in a few sentences, but let me just say a couple things to that. Certainly, you're absolutely right. I mean, the three Western monotheisms are all children of Abraham. I think there's absolutely no question. They look to Abraham in particular as the model for faith. And they all are certainly very, very strongly and often militantly monotheistic. They share those things very, very much. Islam and Judaism also share the notion of a religious law that, in fact, enables one to be pure and pious and be, a proper worshiper of God. And in the Christian case, we go in a different direction with focusing on the person of the Christ. So we have in each of these traditions different directions, but a lot of very, very similar things. What I think is important to say is that monotheisms, by and large, if you look at world religious history, have probably been the most intolerant forms of religion in religious history as well. And that goes for among themselves as well as being intolerant of others. So none of us have very much to brag about when it comes to being tolerant of people of other faiths. And so I think all three, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, have to really work at it to try to find ways to actually break down the many barriers that have come up, sometimes for political or social or other reasons, but nonetheless they take religious form, and they are pernicious when they do. I always like to say that I'm a little skeptical, frankly, of a lot of religious dialogue, because they, in my experience, are often two monologues, particularly among Jews and Muslims and Christians. They're often monologues directed at each other on the things that each holds most sacred. I like to think of, and I'd like to believe that's what we try to do in a university divinity school, and that is to bring people of different faiths like this together, not to focus on each other and on their most sacred and the most contentious things, but to focus on things that matter to all of them, such as social issues, such as issues of personal piety, even issues of worship. Because it's quite possible in doing that, by focusing on a tertium quid, if you like, instead of on one another, to begin to discover the other person who's now standing beside you, because you both are focused on a third thing, as another human being. And that's what's been very hard for Christians to do about Jews, or Muslims to do about Christians, and so on around the circle. That's not been easily done in history. But I think today, in a world that is becoming so cosmopolitan and so interlocked, I again am going to be optimistic, even in the middle of a world that doesn't look very optimistic, and say that the possibilities still are open there for people actually to discover each other as different, but no less faithful and no less good and no less intent upon the important things in life. And I think that's true of all three traditions.
What are your views on the so-called Arab Spring? And do you believe this movement will continue and be successful?
Well, I'd like to think it would be as successful as the Prague Spring was back in '68. I wish I thought that were the case. What I'm hopeful is that at least in one or two instances out of these various cases, and as I've indicated, I think everyone is different. When you get to Syria again, you've got an extremely different situation altogether, and one that I think is probably the most volatile, and maybe will be, it certainly looks like it's going to be the bloodiest. But all my hope is that one or two of these, what I would call people's revolutions, if you like, is going to succeed. If Egypt, for instance, were able to achieve some kind of stability, it would be, I think, something to build upon, and something for other Arab countries and in the wider Muslim world, for other Islamic countries to build on. If they all fail, we are probably looking at a very, very bleak future, because not only will the high hopes of a lot of people be dashed in these countries, it will also even seem harder for peoples to rise up against tyrannical governments and actually break them down. So I'm cautious about what to predict here. I mean, I have colleagues who are much better specialists in this area of the contemporary world than I am, and they tell me they have no idea what's going to happen. I mean, they know a lot better than I know, but they have no idea. So I would be the last person, I think, to make predictions. But my hope is, as I say, that if one of these really succeeds in some significant fashion, even if a few others fail, it won't be the end of this. That's my feeling. Okay. Yes, we've got one.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we have been listening to a Friday forum featuring Professor William Graham, Dean of the Faculty of Divinity at Harvard University. Thank you very much, Professor Graham. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.